welcome everybody. For a few of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Kellogg Institute, Paolo Carrozza, and it's a real pleasure here to be able to introduce you to my colleague and friend Patrizio, and as well as to moderate this what promises to be a really interesting discussion of some research that he's doing and related to the Ford program. So if you haven't had a chance to meet Patrizio, he's joined us as an associate professor in the Keough School of Global Affairs almost 2 years ago in 2019. And just in time to come and run out the pandemic here, right, Patrizio? Rather than in South Africa, where he was at the University of Cape Town before coming to Notre Dame. And we got to South Africa from Italy, where he had done his PhD at the University of Siena. We'll hear about some of his research today, so I won't take the time to tell you about what he focuses on. But more importantly, I'll just highlight that Patrizio has, as of January, been appointed also as the new director of the Ford Family Program in Human Development Studies and Solidarity. So has just taken the reins recently and has, I think, already an exciting vision for where that program is going, which is so central to what the Kellogg Institute as a whole is about. So Patrizio, we're eager to hear your research, but maybe you want to take a few minutes first to tell us about what's going on with the Ford program, since this is the Ford research series here, and what you anticipate will for the near future there.
That's great. Thanks, Paolo. Yes. So yeah, we thought it would be good to spend 4 or 5 minutes, given the change of leadership in the Ford program, to talk a little bit about what we see happening in the future. And I think the first thing to do when doing that is to thank the Ford family for the great support for putting this together. I see that Erwin also joined us. I see Doug. And so really thank you. This is an amazing program. One of my top goals is to, and Eli and I are working on an aggressive dissemination campaign to really make the program prominent on campus and outside, even more so than it is already. And so again, thank you so much. I don't know if Father Bob is here, but I want also to thank Father Bob for the excellent work he's done. And it's kind of humbling actually to take over from him because he has several skills that I do not possess. However, I hope to maximize my skills. And so I'm going to tell you in a second what I think we're going to focus on. So I'll just have one slide about this. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I think you're, oh yeah. I think I'm sharing the wrong one. Sorry about that. Are you seeing my presentation slides? Are you seeing this one?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So let me again spend a couple of minutes on what we do. So the Ford program has the vision and the mission of the program is to promote an holistic model of human flourishing. And this is rooted in the dignity and the full potential of the human person. And we think that the distinctiveness of the program is that not all research starts from this very strong normative vision. How does that operationalize? Well, the first component is that the questions we ask are informed by this. So you're not going to find a lot of very abstract and not too relevant, not too applicable to the life of people type of research in this program. So we focus on research that it's informed by Catholic social teaching and so has the human person as the center of it. And so we call that research that matters. Now, this is informed by Catholic social teaching, but is obviously of universal applicability. So vulnerability, poverty, growth, human flourishing, those, you don't need to be Catholic to be interested in these kind of topics. And so we hope that the body of evidence we generate will be actually relevant to several different contexts. The second component that makes us distinctive is about research methods. So we want to combine rigor, and rigor is necessary because it makes us credible, and that comes through peer review, through interactions with policy bodies, and it's hard to have policy impact if what you do is not accepted as credible evidence. So the rigor is an essential component of this. But because we have an approach that perhaps some disciplines don't necessarily incentivize, and I'm thinking of my own discipline, economics, where some of the questions we ask may not seen as a central question. And maybe today's talk is part of that. And so you can see how a program that allows you to spend time on questions and methods that perhaps your discipline, your departments don't necessarily reward you for, it's crucial, because then you have this venue where you can find the resources, the support, and the like-minded people to do that kind of work. And this essentially, in practical terms, amounts to do research that is interdisciplinary, and research that has mixed methods. So for instance, today I will talk a little bit about some qualitative work we did, which again is not very typical of people in my discipline. That's what I meant by mixed methods here. And ambitiously, and we had discussions with this in our subcommittee a few months ago, I believe, is how do we actually make IHD a sort of mainstream concept? How do we make this a concept that people can refer to, they know what it means, and can we as academics, on top of all the other efforts we have outside of academia, can we play our role here to help define this concept in a way that it's not something that people refer to as vague and not easy to operationalize? So that's ambitious because it's not an easy task, but that's what we do. And last but not least, our research has some, let's say, boundaries that we don't cross. So for instance, we do not engage in research that is exploitative. And I'm not saying that other research is, but sometimes it happens because if you don't start from a position of community engagement and acceptance and understanding of the people you're interacting to, perhaps you may have the best intention. And by the way, this applies also to non-research intervention like aid workers and international organizations. But the idea of being community, having involvement in the community and understanding the needs of the people you're interacting with, that should avoid or at least minimize the risk of interventions that may be have a negative impact on the local community. And on top of that, we want research, and if you're funded by our program, it's sort of an accountability measure that I want to insert even stronger than it is already, which is we want to hear how the community benefited from your study. What is it they learned? Do we have some tangible elements that lead us to see that? For instance, Jackie in Kenya just shared an op-ed in one of the main newspapers in Nairobi. That's amazing. So that's what we want to see. And so that's really the main components of our program. So, and again, Ilaria and I are putting together a piece that we want to share widely. So we want people to not say, oh, well, I don't know what you guys do. This is what we do. And we're going to give you examples. And so we're going to just step up the communication mechanisms, the channels that we have. And again, none of this is me because I just joined. This is all Father Bob and the excellent team he had at his collaborating with him. So, okay, sorry for being a bit quick, but today's talk is actually about a specific paper. And it's a paper on fairness concerns and how does your concerns for fairness affect the demand for redistribution. And this is a simple experiment in South Africa with South African students. And it's joint work with my former graduate students in South Africa, Joanna, who is now a postdoc there. So the idea for the study is starts from the what we know in the social sciences, that people's support for redistribution is partly determined by what they perceive to be an unfair outcome. Okay, but even in the face of unfairness, what are the limiting factor of redress some of this unfairness? The main problem with answering this question is that it's hard, first of all, to know what people think is just or unjust. And so the idea, it's not like a simple variable that you can measure in in some administrative record or things like that. And also, you may ask people what they think, but what they think or what they say may not necessarily translate into what they do. So if it comes for a referendum to support more, public schools or something like that, do people who say that are more in favor for redistribution also willing to pay more taxes to support the public schools, even though their kids don't go there? I think we went through this recently in South Bend. So it's very relevant to everyday's life. So the approach here is to use a simple experiment in a context which I'll motivate in a second, is particularly uniquely apt for this kind of questions, to explore your preferences through what you actually do. Now, obviously, this is not, again, raising your property tax. That would be a real experiment, like a scale experiment. But this is, there's real stakes, there is real money involved. So we hope this creates first evidence on this type of questions. So the context is one of the largest universities in South Africa. And the reason why the country, as Paolo was saying, I spent a good chunk of my early career there, so I know quite a bit about the place. And it's a place where these are not questions that are rare part of discussions. In fact, inequality, especially when it comes to race inequality, more recently gender inequality, are questions, I'm not exaggerating, everyday questions. And partly, or perhaps mostly due to the legacy of the country, where there was institutional segregation and institutional unfairness before democracy. So the discussion about redressing these past injustices are everyday discussions, are part of even the curriculum discussions in universities and schools there. So this is something that they think a lot about. And the sample of people we're going to have here is diverse along those lines. So we can, we're not just interviewing people who may be more likely to be on one or the other side of this type of debate. And despite 25 years, actually more now, 27 years of democracy, this is still one of the most unequal countries in the world. And part of it is that it's very hard to correct such a large disparity to start with. And one would expect with this high inequality that there will be higher demand for redistribution, especially given the clearly unfair origin of it. Again, apartheid. Yet, when you go to World Valley Survey, you find that South Africa is not an outlier. So South Africa is an outlier when it comes to Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, but it's not an outlier when it comes to redistribution demand. So this prior that many of us have of, okay, well, there's high inequality, surely there's going to be more demand for redistribution. That's not actually the case. And actually the literature shows that. So this is a very interesting case to study also because of that. So how are we going to do this? We're going to study the redistributive decisions of a group of stakeholders. I'll define them in a second. So the way the experiment works is that there is two anonymous workers, and these are real people, and they're paired, and they do a task. And then there is a third party that decides how the gain from this task is split between these two players. And what we're going to focus on is the trade-off between self-interest, because this redistribution may cost me something, and fairness. How fair is the split between these two other people? So that's our focus. And what we're going to vary is the initial split, how much inequality are we creating between these two real students? And so we ask ourselves, what is an acceptable level of inequality? And also we're going to vary how much it costs me as the third person, the stakeholder, to redistribute. So intuitively, we would expect that the higher the inequality, the more we may perceive unfairness, so the more redistribution. And also intuitively, we would expect that the higher the cost to me of redistributing, the lower I would be willing to redistribute. So that's why we talk about self-interest versus fairness concerns. We also contextualize this in terms of the source of inequality. So most people would agree that inequality that derives from your own effort and your own control may be less objectionable than inequality that derives purely from lack, or again, from institutional segregation or institutional policies. So we're going to vary that to see if this concern for fairness changes depending on whether this income split is due to luck or to a productivity-related choice. Okay, so this is the setup of the study. Usually in econ talks now, everybody would interrupt me and ask a bunch of questions, but we're doing the non-econ way of doing this. So I'm going to give you just a preview of the findings, and then I'll give you the details. So what we find is that the willingness to redistribute, so to move from player A to player B, is less when I have a higher personal cost, as I say, intuitively. And it's also depends on the level of initial inequality. And the source of inequality makes a significant difference. So when inequality comes from luck, people are more willing to redistribute. Now, the real novelty of the paper is that in the second part, which is the source of inequality matters more at lower level of initial inequality. So for instance, I'll show you, I'm more likely to redistribute when inequality derives from things that are outside people's control, like lottery. However, when I go to very high levels of inequality, then the difference between the two treatment conditions is actually less. So essentially, in a sense, even if you deserve to earn more, there's only so much more you should be allowed to earn. That's what the studies show. However, when we go to the personal cost of redistribution, then the source matters less. So in a sense, the inequality aversion does depend on the source. So the inequality aversion sort of trumps the source of inequality, while the personal interest is not as strongly related. And I'll show you in a second a graph that really shows that. Now, where does this fit in the literature and in the policy world? Well, obviously, this has to do with ideas of distributive justice. What is a fair distribution of income? You know, some people argue there should be no differences. Everybody should have, so that's a fully egalitarian way of seeing it. On the other hand, you have the fully libertarian. Everything that you do should be, you should be sort of rewarded for what you do. So a lot of it depends on this idea of what you think you're responsible for. And there's a bunch of studies showing that. However, there is also a number of studies showing that people are not completely selfish. As humans, we actually care about other humans. And now, as an economist, I sound excited and surprised about it, but it was a new finding. You know, we assumed for a long time that people just cared about their own interest. And then in the past 20, 30 years, we found out through experiments and other studies that actually we care about other people, even if it costs to us, which is, again, nice to know and nice to prove. So how do we put together these two things? I have self-interest, but I also care about other people, and I care about fairness. And again, this distinction between what you think is your fault and what you think is in your control and what is not plays a very crucial role in this trade-off between self-interest and fairness. One typical example that is given in the literature is the differential attitudes between Europeans and Americans. In Europe, people are more like, this is from the World Value Surveys. In Europe, people are more likely to accept inequality because Europeans generally think that your economic status depends in part by things that you didn't really deserve. And in the States, there is more this idea that You are where you are because of what you did. And that, again, translates into redistributive decisions. But our focus here is in emerging countries who typically have more inequality, and the literature is very scant. So we think we have contribution there because usually, again, a lot of the literature is about comparing Canada and US and Europe, Australia. But what about one of the most unequal countries with such a peculiar past? So that's our contribution, in which we vary these elements. I'm going to go a little faster here because I've already spoke about that. And so I'm just going to focus on the policy relevance here. If the self-interest motivations are not overly affected by the source of inequality, then the scope of certain policies that we generally consider as potentially useful we may have less room there. If it's true that people care and they may willing to vote for certain policies that imply redistribution, but if the cost to me is such an incredibly powerful variable, then perhaps we should think of ways to work on that side of things rather than just counting on people's perceived fairness. So it has clear policy implication. One example could be perhaps a campaign which you let people know how important this is for other people may not be enough if it's not paired with some public economics or finance idea of how to do this in a way that doesn't really take too much from the people who are supposed to give more. And in fact, we even see it in our experiment, this has practical implication for the level of disparities after redistribution. So essentially, how much we're willing to give affects obviously what the situation is after we have redistributed. So it has, as I said, real world implications. Okay, now this is going to be a little tough, but I'll run you through the experiment. There are 2 rounds. In the first round, which we call production phase, the 2 students are paired and they work on a set of tasks. So that's the work phase. Then one of them is more productive than the other, and that's called player A and player B. In the decision phase, a third person decides how much these 2 people should be paid, player A and player B. And I'll show you the schedule in a second. What I want you to understand here is that the person who decides the split does not participate in the game. But these are real people. The game, the tasks did happen. So the people are waiting to be compensated. Okay. And the compensation is decided by this third person. Now, the way this can happen is either by player A being assigned by who is the most productive, or player A being assigned by a coin. So in one treatment condition, player A is the person who won the lottery, and player B, irrespective of who was most productive. And in the second condition, player A is the more productive one, and player B is the less productive one. And so how decision makers do their split is our primary interest in these different conditions. In total, we had 335 students split by about 220 workers and 116 stakeholders, which is the decision makers. So what we are interested in is, is this part here. How do they trade off their self-interest, because there's going to be a cost involved with redistributing, with the fact that some of the splits are clearly unfair. So we are going to see what happens there. And the way we do that is through this, I'll walk you through this decision schedule. So player A is either the more productive player or the luckier player, depending on which group you're in. And each decision maker is only assigned to one of the groups. So for instance, in this group of decisions, the difference between A and B is very high. One player gets everything, the other player gets 0. And if the person decides to redistribute in the first row, this person doesn't pay anything. in this row, this person would pay 45 out of 100 that is going to be otherwise allocated. So the decision to redistribute may come with a cost or not. Down here, the inequality is lower. So it's 60-40. And you still have your personal cost to redistribution. So for example, here, if I say yes, that I want to redistribute, both players get 50-50 instead of 9-10. But I, the third party stakeholders, I now have to pay 15 rands of tax in order for this to happen. So there is a cost to me. If I say no, players get 9 and 10, and I get my full 100. So the way it works is that the stakeholders are told, listen, there is two players. In the luck treatment, we tell them, player A won the lottery, player B lost the lottery, even though they did the same task. Now, the way they're paid is going to be one of these combinations. Now, you tell us what we do when one of these combinations is randomly selected. So essentially, the payment is going to happen randomly. It's going to be one of these. But really, we don't care about that for our study. What we care is that the stakeholder knows that, okay, this could be what's going to happen. Okay, what do I want to do in that situation? Oh, this could be what is going to happen. So what we're going to do in this situation. So we have 25 scenarios that are real in the sense that they all have a probability of being chosen. And Taryn is asking a question in the chat. Yes, decision makers are never workers. They are always third-party stakeholders. So they decide on a potential split. And this has real implications because one of this split is going to be chosen. So the decision maker knows, for instance, that in row 5, if I split and row 5 gets picked, then I'm going to pay 45 rand tax. If I don't split, I'm going to keep my own 100 rands. Okay, so this is an hypothetical situation, and this gives us 25 decisions. So our sample goes up, and we can draw some conclusions. Now, I understand that in 25 minutes this is maybe a little too much, but really the key here is that I am deciding how to split, and sometimes the split derives from luck, sometimes it derives from merit, and depending on the initial level of inequality, which will be very high or minimal, and depending on the cost to me, I'm going to see what happens to the probability of me saying yes. So essentially, this is going to be our variable we're interested in. What is the probability of me circling yes, depending on how much it costs me and how much the distance between the two people is. So each decision maker has 25 decisions. So let's show some results. I'm not going to show you regressions. I thought it would be better to show it in simple histograms. So first of all, taking the average of all these decisions, in the luck treatment, about 50% of this decision, so that will be 25 times however many stakeholders we have, okay? So if we take all this decision and just take a simple average, 50%, almost 50%, they choose yes. This is across all different inequality levels and across all different all different cost level. In the merit treatment, there is less willingness to redistribute, okay? So again, when I am told that the person who was more productive is the one earning more, I'm less likely to circle yes. When I'm told that irrespective of productivity, I'm likely to say no here, sorry. When I'm told that irrespective of productivity, one player gets more than the other, then I'm more likely to say yes. So I'm more likely to redistribute. So this is evidence that we do care about the source of income inequality. A severe homo economicus who only cares about himself would always choose no, except for the zero cost. All right. So the fact that this is 50% tells us that the 100% homo economicus doesn't exist. So we have at least some willingness to redistribute, even if it costs something to us. And I'll show you some of the responses they gave in the qualitative survey, that there is one or two people who are real homo economicus. Now, I don't know how I'm doing with time. Please, Teresa, show me some warning when I have like 5 minutes left, please. So the willingness to redistribute depends by cost level. So you see, when it costs me nothing here, 0, then I'm very likely to redistribute, whether I'm in the luck or in the merit system. Now, see this, where when it costs me 0, there is still 20% of people who still decide not to redistribute, even if it costs them nothing, and even if this was purely luck, which means that there is a 20% of this group that thinks that luck is something that needs to be rewarded. So even if it was outside your control, you won. So you keep the what you earned because you won. So, and that again, that's a version of how much we care about fairness in a sense, because luck will be the opposite of fairness. So you see how as the cost increases, people redistribute less and less. So this is essentially a 45% tax, average tax rate. And essentially here you have very little distribution. Still, you see that there is quite a difference between whether you're here or there. So what this shows is that when it costs us something, we may be less likely to redistribute. And this is true whether the distribution I'm presented with comes from luck or productivity. What about initial inequality? Here, the bigger the difference between the loser and the winner, the more likely I am to redistribute. And the less important, which is the finding I was telling you earlier, and this is confirmed by our regressions, which I'm not going to show. So here is the main finding. When the distance is just too much, when the difference is just too much, then the source matters less. So maybe you were the more productive player, so you did work better, but man, you should earn 100 and the other one 0. So, I mean, the other person did do some work, okay? So the difference between the source of inequality matters more at lower level of inequality, which speaks about an interaction between these two fairness ideals. I'm going to have to go a little quicker because Therese gave me a warning. Now, what happens in the two treatments? So if we calculate the level of inequality after all these decisions have been made, then in the merit one, we find ourselves with a higher inequality, still below the 0.6 from which we start. And we did it 0.6 because it's close to the Gini coefficient for South Africa. So we wanted to be realistic. So there is some change in the inequality, even in the productivity condition, but it goes down less than in the merit condition, which essentially, this is just to show you that there is a direct consequence of how much distribution I do in terms of what people are left with after redistribution. What about by cost? Well, obviously, when it costs me nothing to redistribute, the post-redistribution distribution is much more equal. Again, we're starting from 0.6 before redistribution, and now we're 0.15. I mean, I'm not aware of any country with this low Gini coefficient, maybe Finland, I'm not sure. So you see that when it costs me nothing, we are all about equality. But when it costs me quite a bit, then I'm not really redistributing that much. Okay, so this is where I get a little more qualitative. So what we did a survey after the decision-making phase because we didn't want to prime individuals to think in a certain way. So after the decision game, we asked them essentially questions about, probably questions that we have all thought about, right? So a society should aim to equalize income or not. In the long run, hard work is what really determines your success. And should the government take responsibility that everyone is provided for? So we're going to see how this relates to their decisions. We're also going to see in a more qualitative way how things what went through their head when they were doing their decisions. So first of all, we see that there is a fairly high preference for the idea that a society should aim to equalize incomes. Now, some people think that should not, but there is more people on the left part of this graph. So we are in a context of a group of people who think that equalizing income is something worth doing. What about the hard work versus luck and connections question? Now here you see that in our sample, and by the way, this is reflected also in national representative sample in the World Value Survey. So essentially most South Africans believe, again, despite the history in which this was clearly not true, believe that hard work brings you up. And I mean, anecdotally, I can confirm there is a tremendous resilience in that country. People really work hard to do their best given the condition they're given at birth. So you see that this perhaps explains why South Africa is not an outlier when it comes to redistribution. There is this idea that, okay, yeah, the government should help, but really we can also do it. And in fact, when we look at the government here, some people are, most people are somewhere in the middle. Okay. Now, let me give you some, to conclude, let me give you some of the motivations people gave when we asked them, how did you think about this? So you see that in the merit treatment, the word, I mean, this is just some extract, but the word fairness came up more often. Like what mattered was fairness because that guy was more productive. Some people do mention the personal cost. But the idea is that essentially the concepts that we were interested in, are confirmed by this qualitative component that tell us that that's exactly how people were thinking. I'm not going to read all the things, but I wanted to show you some Homo economicus here. Yeah, like the last one. I only changed the payment where the cost is zero, and that's because I want my payment in full. Or there was another one of, it was not a matter of fairness, but a matter of what I will gain. So, and other people instead said something like, yeah, someone else has to be treated fairly. I like this one. It says, I'm for fairness, but only if it doesn't affect my reward. So this is a nice concept. And I think we can all partly agree, right? I'm for fairness, but only if it doesn't severely affect my reward. I see there's some question in the chat. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to bring them up in the Q&A. Okay, so there is more in the paper and I'm going to have to conclude now. But yeah, this is the setup. Let me just give you some concluding remarks. This study provides evidence from an experiment that tests the limits to the willingness of redistribute. And we show that redistribution responds to how distant the split of payments or the inequality is between the workers in our context, but also depends on how costly it is for the decision maker to redistribute. At lower levels of inequality, whether this inequality comes from luck or productivity matters. But at higher level of inequality, it matters less. On the other hand, the negative impact of personal cost on the probability of redistributing is less dependent on the source, which provides evidence of a robust self-interest motivation. And in fact, there is not even universal redistribution at zero cost, which means that some inequality is accepted because it just happens. In fact, one of the stakeholders in the qualitative survey said, well, not everything in life is fair. Some people are born with more, some people are born with less. So there is at least some group of people, 20% in fact, that think, well, you know, bad luck. However, as inequality rises, then the concern for fairness becomes a little more important. Now, all of this is important in a context like South Africa, where there are, again, a number of policies specifically discussed regarding redress and how to reduce inequality, but it's relevant in general in the world where by assuming that people are only motivated by either self-interest or only motivated by either fairness concerns, then perhaps we may make a mistake and we should take into account both. And in terms of research agenda, and for the 4 program in particular, it will be interesting to have more studies that look into what people think is fair, not just in terms of income, but other components, and it could be gender inequality, race inequality. So we believe there is an agenda here that we could explore in terms of how do people develop their idea of fairness. For instance, as a Catholic, does St. Francis, affects you more than other writers? So I think it's important to take this into account. I'm going to stop right here.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Patrizio, for this really interesting study. So there are a few questions that got put in the chat along the way. I think I'll just pull those out and pose them to you. And in the meantime, other people can raise their little virtual hands, and then I'll turn to those questions. So Alejandro asked along the way, just for clarification, how many decisions is each decision maker making? Is it 25 each or some other number?
Right. Yeah. So each decision maker has 25 decisions. That's right.
Okay. And from Nilesh, when you say costs nothing, what does a person get if he or she does not distribute?
Can I clarify that question?
Go ahead. Then go ahead and just pose it directly, Nilesh. Go ahead.
Oh, great. Yeah, I was just trying to understand sort of the connection between who's making the decision and sort of where in the distribution you are, and sort of like how that corresponds to experiment.
That's a good point. So there's two points here. One is that in the experimental condition, all the stakeholders are getting the same amount, the same endowment, 100. And so everybody is at the same level. So we abstract from where you are in the distribution at the experimental condition. In terms of what our participants are like in terms of the overall South African distribution, which is probably partly what you're asking, these are students in the top university in the continent, but a lot of them do come from lower income backgrounds. I didn't show you the demographics, but if you use race as a proxy of income, which in South Africa is a fairly good proxy, then you see that we don't have just rich people, but we have a good mix. Does that answer your question?
You were too kind. My question was a lot less sophisticated. I was just trying to understand sort of, you had sort of player A, player B, and a decision maker.
Right.
And I was just, when you said that there was a cost to the decision maker,
yeah,
was their initial endowment 100 Rand?
That's right.
I see. And so then the player A and player B are like abstract concepts to that decision maker. Is that correct?
They're not abstract. They're real people. They know those guys actually played.
Oh, they know those guys who actually played. So, but they're third party. So who does that third party correspond to, like in the world? Like
yeah, I understand what you're saying. Well, here the idea is to look at the social preference. So we are abstracting from, this is not the typical taxpayer, because the typical taxpayer would be directly affected from the fiscal situation. But that's by design. This is called stakeholder design exactly for this. And that's the novelty of the paper. Here I'm completely, I'm a benevolent decision maker, and I just want to know what I care about, because that's the research question.
But you don't have sorry, I'll stop here. You don't have a stakeholder who is, like the equivalent of Bill Gates, who does not want to be taxed versus okay.
That's right.
Great. Sandra, I think you're next. Go ahead, please.
Sorry. Thank you, Paolo. Patrizio, thank you for this presentation. I'm very glad to see this kind of research at Notre Dame. I have some questions / comments. The first one is that this design, to say that's the novelty of the design, but this is a design that was implemented in 2014.
Yes, the Norwegians. Yeah.
Yes, and which is the nicest thing about this topic, despite that you mentioned that it's not for the mainstream economics wouldn't be attractive. Actually, in the last 6 years, we have publications in the top journals in economics on this topic by the team that actually designed this game.
Yeah.
And my question is, this is not different from that design. And actually, I'm implementing this design with refugees, migrant Venezuelans, and Colombians.
Nice. So, okay, we need to talk.
And many people are looking at that. It's a very nice design, and you just put it in the field, and it works.
No,
But
do you have a question?
Yes, my question is about the contribution in terms of the results are beautiful because that show that the experiment was well conducted, that is internally valid, is perfect.
Right.
But then have you thought about going further? Because you mentioned in the objectives of the study to relate that to real decisions. I mean, are actually these students concerned in real life about
exactly? And that's why I was saying maybe this is not for an econ journal, because then Nilesh questions comes in. Okay, but how does this relate to the actual way we redistribute through taxes and things like that? And I think that what makes me a little scared of going into an econ journal. So Journal of Public Economics, I think it would be a bit not too sure about this because I'm abstracting so much, because I'm actually interested, and that's where the fourth program part of it is. I'm actually interested in the person. How do we think? And a little less on what do I do when it comes to deciding whether the tax rate is 3 or 4. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, when I said novel, I didn't mean the actual stakeholder design. I meant the fact that in the stakeholder design, which was designed by the Norwegians, by the way, the Norwegians, not the most unequal people in the world. There's a reason why this research comes from there, right? The novel part is that we are introducing the inequality difference and the cost in the stakeholder design. So sorry if I misspoke there.
Thank you. Taryn.
Hi, thanks, Patrizio. I have one quick question, which we can probably deal with afterwards, and then just one comment. I'd be very curious to see how your results differ by race, because it's South Africa, and especially if you have, I don't know how much information you reveal to the workers or decision makers about race, but it would be very interesting to see what if there is a race dimension of what you're finding. And then my comment is really about, I guess, an extension. So I don't know this literature, I don't know how these experiments work very much, but it seems to me that in drawing out the social preference of the stakeholder, you're also limiting the extent to which learning can happen, learning about, what my social preference looks like. So if you're only a stakeholder throughout the experiment, you never get a chance to be a worker, and you never get to be on the losing end of the redistribution decision or the winning end of the redistribution decision. And so I guess one question is maybe this has already been done in the literature, but it would be really nice to think about how you could modify your design to actually give the stakeholders a chance to learn about what it's like being on the other side, and then see whether that affects how they make those decisions. Thanks.
That's amazing, Taryn. I agree. So essentially, you're imagining a repeated game in which sometimes I'm a stakeholder, sometimes I'm a worker. So I know how bad it feels when the lottery tells me that I have 0 and the other guy has 100. I love that. I like it a lot. Yeah. Thanks, Terry.
Terrific. Thank you. Abby Cordova, let's go to you, please.
Hi, Patrizio. This is great research, and just remind me of my previous research agenda. So it happened that long time ago, I wrote my dissertation on support for redistribution, and in particular, looking at the effect of social trust on redistribution. And so with your research, I mean, an important question emerges, which is, given the importance of self-interest or the cost, right? The consideration of the cost for supporting redistribution, what can we do to actually reverse that so people are, have higher levels of solidarity with others? And so based on that research that I have conducted, so social trust is one of them. So people who trust others, they are more likely to redistribute independently of their own wealth and the cost to them. And that said, we also know that social trust actually is undermined under contexts that are very diverse, particularly ethnically. And so my question to you is related to what you were asked before, which is the importance of self-interest and kind of this resistance to support redistribution when the cost goes up. I wonder, if we will find a similar super strong effect as what you find, given that South Africa is a ethnically heterogeneous country. So talk more about the external validity of the experiment and how can we maybe that's part of the research agenda, right? Testing some of the same mechanisms in other contexts. And I do think that the identity of the recipient of the redistribution, as well as the one giving, maybe race, as you said, gender, is part of the question, and how that might vary. But that's just right. I love what you are doing, and thanks you so much.
No, that's great. And in fact, by the way, your comment reminds me that I didn't respond to the first part of Taryn's question, which was about revealing the identity of the other players, which, again, as you're suggesting, could be another experiment, right? Because is my redistribution towards somebody who looks different than me, am I more likely to care less about the cost? So that's clearly, and it's essentially what we are thinking of doing, right? The other one about generalizability, I'll tell you, at dinner, at a conference, I was involved with the Norwegian groups that Sandra was talking about. And they were we didn't go anywhere because maybe the COVID or whatever, it just didn't happen. They were thinking about doing a 4-country study, which was Norway, US, South Africa, and Brazil. And I think that would probably give the sort of variability you're thinking. And perhaps if we can, we should throw another European country there, perhaps a little more diverse than Norway. But you're right. There is no claim here that this easily generalizes to other countries. In fact, the literature from that group shows that these results are very, very different. They compare Norway, US, for instance. And Americans just think differently than Norwegians, unsurprisingly, perhaps. And one more thing you said, which I think is crucial, and again, it works into the 4-program type of questions that matters, is the social trust. And unfortunately, again, World Value Survey and other surveys in South Africa show that social trust is not a lot. It's not big in a country with such a history of division. So that could be that even in and here perhaps could be a little higher because at least they're students in the same place. But even then, there's still quite a bit of distrust. So yes, that's a very good point. Thanks.
Terrific. We do have a few more minutes for at least a couple more questions, I think. Clark Gibson, welcome from the early hours on the West Coast.
Clark, I owe you a dinner.
I came prepared. I'll go fast. Number one is, it's very curious. Your findings are nice and tight and clean. Curious because, so South Africa is the land of service protests. So you would think you would have merit quite different. And that goes to everyone else's, many of our colleagues here, issues about generalizability. And I didn't read the paper, but this would be 400 times more interesting if this varied with other countries. So 3 is the sample here is everything, not just the game, but the sample. You've got university students, which is typical. And so I don't know what the 4-country panel will be, but obviously when we talk about redistribution, your wealth is just enormously important in the literature over the last 2,000 years, your attitudes toward redistribution. So really the big cleavages in the world would be money, race, gender, ethnicity, and if those could vary but in reality in your sample or by assignment on both the decider and the recipients, that's the variation. I know that makes a million arms. 3 is World Value Survey over time in South Africa would be super interesting because, ANC keeps pushing that they're the greatest thing in the world. How long does a colonial legacy and an apartheid legacy have you? At first it was a very socialist party. Is that falling off with young people? This is why your sample matters. They could be now more Western or more capitalist. So it'd be very interesting. And finally is, I know econ journals now don't love the experiment than a post-survey work as much as they used to. They like real behavior. And I don't know this literature, but it'd be super interesting to give money to people and then I don't know what, you'd have not a friend there, but maybe a guy or a gal dressed as a priest, 20 feet away, and someone's asking for money for the ANC and like actual to see if anybody gives their share of money. And then not only is that super interesting and not cheap like an answer on a survey, but it's also real behavior that our business would like in journals.
Right.
Patrizio, before you answer those, let's collect the one last question from Eowyn, because we only have a couple minutes left.
Perfect.
And then with whatever time you can choose to, cherry pick what you're going to respond to. Okay. So Eowyn, go ahead. Let's hear from you.
Thank you. I had to step away for a second, so I'm sorry if you touched on this, but I think Clark hit on it too. But it was Karen's question in the chat about the income, where the individual, the stakeholder making the decision, like where they were coming from and how that would affect the study, or if that was taken into account. But Clark just mentioned that in his list of things, but that was my same question. I think that would really, have an impact on what an individual will decide, and it may not be what we think actually.
Right. So that's a great question. And there's two answers, I guess. One is anecdotally, is this a lot of money? But there's also what the literature shows in this type of experiments, how much you need to make it matter. So on the second part, we're definitely above that threshold of how much you need compared to the median income and so on to make it matter. This is young people at a university. You're giving them the equivalent of about $10 in that period, which in Slovakia gets you a few meals if you're a student. And that's what generally matters for this kind of experimental conditions. Anecdotally, obviously, and in some of the extracts, which perhaps I put in the slides or not, I don't remember, some people say, well, if the difference is 1 rand, I don't care. So clearly, it was part of the experimental condition to make just the difference between 0 and 1 for us was very important. And I didn't spend too much time on that because that's the Homo economicus one. 1 rand is really nothing. Even, it's really little. And so if people start changing their behavior from 0 to 1, then self-interest is very high. So that, I think, answers your question. And so we don't have stakes that are super high as okay, do you want to increase your tax rate from 25 to 30? But for the context we're looking at, I think that's high enough, at least academically speaking. So thanks, that's a great point. And for Clark, I'll say that I'll keep the dressed as a priest comment because I think it's great. And I know in political science, there are these experiments that people are stopped in the street and they're asked to make donations. So that's great. And the generalizability thing, again, the novelty was in varying things that in the literature haven't been varied yet. And so we abstract from everything else. And you know better than me, when you do that, you lose generalizability. So as Sandra said, we went for internal validity here. So yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you, Patrizio. This has been great for the paper itself, but also the way that it's situated within the Ford program and the future of the Ford program. It's just terrific to see the questions being developed. And I'm sure we could go on for quite a long time. There are other questions in the chat. There were hands getting raised at the end, but unfortunately we are completely out of time now. So just invite everybody to keep track of what's going on at the Ford program, and you'll see this research and a lot of other interesting research of our various other faculty members who are associated with it increasingly appearing there, and we're excited about that future. So thanks everybody for coming this morning.
Well done.
Especially those of you who have come from far away to join us. So we're really grateful to have your presence. It's good to see you.
Thank you so much.
See you next time.